made a deal with my younger brother that if this video gets 10,000 likes, he has to read Vinland Saga. So yeah, the first time I read Vinland Saga now was 2.5 years ago, and I don't think I need to say that a lot has changed within my own personal life, as well as I can imagine in your life as well in those last 2.5 years, going 3 now. And I don't mean to say this in a way that's demeaning to anyone who might be younger in reading Vinland Saga, but I truly think the older you get when reading a story like this, the more you appreciate certain character moments. And it has nothing to do with intelligence, but if not just life experience. Something that I'll get into a little more later on. And so in this specific video, I kind of want to go over my thoughts having reread the series from the prologue all the way through Baltic Sea and the current arc of Vinland and just all of that. And the prologue to Vinland Saga is an incredibly strong start. We get our main character, Thorfinn, who's established, but although he's very well established within the story, especially when we get his perspective and view from his childhood, finding out how Askeladd basically killed his father, we get a good sense of who Thorfinn is and his motives and why he is the way he is, but yet it also does a really great job of setting up all these other pieces that will become essential throughout the plot as the story moves forward. It does a really great job in such a short amount of time, it feels like, of showing the change in characters like Canute, and we even get to see the eventual plot twist with Askeladd and how his character ends off, and how forever that would leave an impact on Thorfinn. However, before we can continue forward, we do need to address arguably the most important person in Thorfinn's life outside of Askeladd, and that's his own father, Thor's. Vinland Saga is a story that constantly gets compared and put next to Berserk and Vagabond, and that's mainly due to the striking similarities between its main characters. The first one being their relationship with their father figures in their early life. Thorfinn's father was a changed man of example, someone who now lived as a pacifist versus Musashi and Guts, who their father figures just like to pass fists. And Thor's is willing to fight if necessary, however he tries to avoid that, knowing the pain and suffering that killing other people brought him. And that's the last thing he wants his son to go through. Well, you try. And so after you have Askeladd's murder of Thor's, Thorfinn is now under Askeladd's sort of group, if you will, working for him as long as he gets the opportunity to duel Askeladd and kill him. Thorfinn is a character that is dead set on revenge. However, that revenge wouldn't be fulfilled. As the story goes on, we find out more about Askeladd and his past and why he is the way he is, and eventually that leads to the climax of the prologue where he kills the current king, and he is killed himself by Canute, and that was the only way to sort of get out of this messy situation where Canute can now be put on top. And so Thorfinn is robbed of his hatred, of his vengeance, of his satisfaction. But I think the interesting thing is, if Thorfinn had killed Askeladd, would he have even really felt satisfied moving forward from that? And so I think the prologue is an incredibly strong start to the series. It's one where you really get this sense of tension, not only with the plot, but with the personal dynamic between Thorfinn and Askeladd and how that is going to turn out. Although I think it's made very clear in that moment of the story that Thorfinn is nowhere near Askeladd, and so you think that dynamic is going to continue longer and longer throughout the story until Askeladd sacrifices himself in order to put Canute over. And I think that action, along with everything done previously, establishes Askeladd as a very well thought out character, someone who even in the most dire of situations finds a way to execute his plans, and he's a fan favorite for a reason. An extremely well-developed character for what feels like a short amount of time when binge reading it. We then move on to what I think most people would consider the strongest portion of Vinland Saga, and that is farmland. And there's a multitude of reasons for this, but I think the first thing we need to get into is the actual setting of putting your character on a farm, and why this worked really well with Thorfinn, as well as with Musashi, of course, using Thorfinn as the primary example. Compared to the prologue, we now have Thorfinn as a slave on this farm. In comparison to what happened in the prologue and what will happen in the arc after this, a lot of the external conflicts, at least surrounding where Thorfinn is very minuscule by comparison. Therefore, the main focus of this entire arc isn't the external conflicts, the physical ones, but if not, the internal conflicts are now front and center. Thorfinn looks very different in this setting than he did in the prologue. You take this vengeful, brutal killer, this assassin, and you put him on a farm. And Thorfinn's attitude, his spirit, is very different the way he expresses himself, and the way that we see him express himself to his eventual partner and what would pretty much be his closest friend throughout the series. In Einar, we really get to see what Thorfinn is about internally. And in this stage in the story, he's completely defeated. He's being dragged down by all the weight and the guilt, and he is being haunted by all of the people that he's murdered. And that's something that sticks with him throughout the rest of the story. But truly in this period, Thorfinn feels like he has no purpose in living anymore. The world that he's known as a kid has only taken everything from him. He's tired. He's exhausted. He doesn't see a purpose in living forward in life if it's just going to be a cycle. As he says, he no longer has his hatred, until now he feels empty. But yet he gets words of encouragement by the old man, who's the father of the current master of the farm, basically saying that being empty is the best thing you can be if you want to be reborn, if you want to be changed. And I think this is the message in the Farmland arc that really hits home the hardest for me, and I think really allows the audience to have a deep appreciation of Thorfinn. And that's, life will hit you, it'll break you down into a ton of pieces, and you have a few options. You let the wind come by and blow those pieces away, and you never put yourself back together, or you could put yourself back together to the person you once were, and you could just repeat the cycle over and over again, or you could put the pieces into something new and mold yourself into somebody different, so now you can move on in life. Again, this idea of being reborn, of being a changed person. And throughout this arc, we see Thorfinn eventually have that moment of clarity, as even, I really like the moment where he went down to quote-unquote Valhalla. Even Askeladd was like, nah, your fight isn't here. You have to climb. And Thorfinn has these reoccurring nightmares, really just the one, and this nightmare sticks with him even until the most recent of chapters. But we see this character who was once this revenge-filled, hate-driven person with no remorse or compassion become this compassionate soul that desires to live a life of peace without hurting more people than he already has. A person very similar to who his father was. Now, I do want to make a slight clarification. Even though, again, I think the internal conflict is, of course, what's front and center, that's not to say that there aren't any external conflicts that happen throughout this arc. There are, even surrounding Thorfinn, with what ends up happening with one of the slaves' husbands who returns in search for her, and that ends up with both of those characters ending up dead. This is something that will happen more and more as the story goes on, especially in the upcoming arc, where Thorfinn's new ideology, his new decision in how he wants to live life, will be tested to the fullest. Can somebody who has taken an oath of peace really live that way in a life that is constantly pushing you to war and conflict? But what I really love about this is it's not only those external conflicts that are a worry to Thorfinn, but it's made very clear throughout the story multiple times that it's Thorfinn's own inner nature. What if he's pushed to his furthest point? What if something he cares about is being put at stake? Will Thorfinn himself, his internal nature, really allow him to hold peace? A wolf in sheep's clothing eventually has to show its true nature. Thorfinn and Einar are then free of their slavery, and it's really in that next arc where we get that test of Thorfinn's nature from many, many different angles, as he's given new information about what actually happened with his father's death, but that is way later on in this upcoming arc. We also get introduced to some new characters that become very essential, with Hild and Gudrid, who is second best girl in the series, as best girl Thorkill was introduced way back in the prologue. By the way, Thorkill is an absolute monster of a character, and I think he adds a little bit of a comedic tone to the series from the beginning, but as the series moves on, I think it adopts that comedic tone more and more and more. And I think Vinland, although of course every story has its arcs, I feel like Vinland's, sometimes its arcs can feel so different from the one that came before it, but yet somehow have a line of consistency throughout that I personally really enjoy. And I think part of that is just due to the massive changes we see in Thorfinn's character. And so as Thorfinn continues to change throughout the story, so will his interactions with other characters, and I don't think I need to say why that has such an effect on how a series can feel. I still think everything that happens, though, in this massive Baltic Sea arc is really incredibly tense, and Thorfinn's being pushed and pulled, again, with the introduction of Hild's character, someone who Thorfinn had killed the father of. she's now this hunter who seeks revenge on Thorfinn, and he seeks to live a life of atonement. And that conflict was really neat. Although, personally, I think her character can become a little repetitive up until the recent chapters due to her really just repeating one phrase of dialogue multiple times. I think it was like at least 4 or 5 times. She basically said to Thorfinn, "Hey, slip up and I'm going to put an arrow in your skull." I'm not exaggerating, but I still think when all of that comes full circle in the most recent chapters, it's still a very satisfying moment. A lot happens throughout this arc, first starting with Thorfinn needing to get a sponsor in order to have resources to go and travel out to Vinland, a place where people won't need swords, and he can essentially be free from all of the war that's going on still amongst some of the Vikings and everything that King Canute now has planned to do, which, by the way, I really like the angle they took with that. Kind of reminded me of Macbeth a little bit, this haunted king thing who is being a little bit reminded of his guilt for what he had to do in order to get into the position he's currently in. So seeing whether or not he's pushed into further insanity is going to be very interesting. And so after Thorfinn gets the sponsor, there ends up being an issue where Gudrid, the man she was supposed to marry, she ends up stabbing and then going on the boat with Thorfinn and the rest of the crew. And eventually Gudrid ends up developing more and more feelings for Thorfinn as this arc goes on. Long story short, Thorfinn ends up being caught in this conflict between 2 different sides. Each side that is essentially looking for a new leader. One of them being Floki, who his grandson is supposed to be the next in line for it. However, the other side is vouching for Thorfinn to be the one who takes sort of the leadership role, which, again, Thorfinn wants to be absolutely nowhere near this conflict at all. However, he gets caught in the middle of it, and as I had brought up earlier, he finds out information that, in fact, it was Floki, the one who had orchestrated the murder of his father, which is, again, where we get to see Thorfinn's inner nature and his rage. And there is a moment throughout this entire story where Thorfinn wonders to himself, can he become a gentler person, a better person? And as this conflict goes on, characters get caught up in all sorts of messes. Thorfinn has to go save them, in fact, and when he does, they eventually get out of this whole conflict. He ends up the leader of the knights and all that, and he decides that, you know what, instead of exacting revenge on Floki, I'm going to exile him and his grandson so then they can live a life of peace, which is what the grandson had expressed to Thorfinn is what he actually wanted, and Thorfinn as well as disbanding these knights before continuing on his adventures to Vinland. I think this arc serves as a really good contrast to the previous one, as we've already gotten our very introspective moment with Thorfinn. Now it's time to see all of this being put to the test, which it is throughout this entire arc, from start to finish, in terms of how he plans on executing this and going into Vinland. Will his new ideology and way of living really uphold throughout this conflict, and once he does arrive on Vinland? And just sort of also seeing his relationship and how that develops with Einar, as well as Hild. Although, again, him and Hild's relationship is pretty much the same thing throughout the entire arc, although I think she's somewhat noticing that Thorfinn is holding true to who he is and what he's trying to be. And the big one is between him and Gudrid, as Gudrid ends up developing more romantic feelings for Thorfinn, eventually confessing her love for him, which the moments between these two is incredibly wholesome. And then we get into the next arc where they actually do arrive on Vinland on the land, and they have to encounter the natives. And once arriving on Vinland, I think the story really comes to a bit of a slowdown in terms of its pace, where once again we get these characters outside of this huge external conflict and not simply trying to figure out how they're going to live in this place as well as coexist with the natives who are there. And we also get a lot of wholesome moments between Thorfinn and some of the other characters, and we even get to find out that Gudrid is pregnant with Thorfinn's child. Now, I can imagine for some, especially those who've been following it, I think Vinland Saga is monthly, if I'm not mistaken. It's probably felt like a very long time since the story might have gone somewhere in terms of conflict the last year or two. But for me, reading it throughout, I actually really enjoy this, seeing such a light-hearted sense of what is going on within the story, especially with Thorfinn. And again, that's just due to his changes as a character. And maybe that's just because I already have a series that's constantly throwing my protagonist in the corner and beating the shit out of him. But even then, this piece that we have throughout the story in the most recent 2-3 chapters has been completely disrupted. I absolutely love the moment where the elder of the natives went to sort of see the future and saw all the death and destruction that would happen if he allowed the Norsemen to stay. But I think what's really interesting is one could argue that that sort of future could have still ended up happening, just in a slightly different variation. Because if it wasn't going to be the Norse in Vinland Saga, then eventually someone else would have came along and settled on that land as well. And the elder essentially baits Thorfinn's people by pretending to like attack Thorfinn, and one of the characters who brought a sword, even though Thorfinn said no to swords, ends up cutting off the elder's hand. However, it was very clear by his facial expression that was the intention. So now we have this conflict of what could end up being a battle, a conflict between the Norsemen and the natives, which is the last thing that Thorfinn wants. In terms of my thoughts on all of this, I truly love all of it, from start to the current moment that it is. I can understand that the recent stuff feels really slow in terms of pace, and you know, things aren't exactly at the high conflict that it was in Baltic Sea or in the prologue, and we're not really getting this incredible, heavy, introspective moment with Thorfinn as we did in Farmland, but I think that's just the story advancing in the way that it should. Again, this is a story that now, reading it, versus when I had first read it 2-3 years ago, I have so much more of an appreciation for, just again, due to certain things that have happened in life, and coming to moments where you wonder, can you really change to be a better person than who you once were? And I wonder if one day when I get older, and if I ever get to have a family of my own, if I'll look at those moments of fatherhood that is shown within the story with Thors and Thorfinn, and then eventually Thorfinn, and hearing the news that Gudrid is pregnant. I wonder if those moments will hit even more emotionally. This idea of wanting to live in a world a certain type of way, but constantly being pushed by the world and your own inner nature to just lash out. This is a story that I would highly recommend to everyone. There are a lot of stories that I cover on the channel where I go, hey, a bit of a heads up on this one. It's not for everyone. And of course, subjective opinion is still going to apply to this series, but I think it's something that everyone should read, because I think it offers a beautiful message of self-improvement and a character who's extremely relatable in depicting moments of deep despair when it comes to self-regret, and wondering if you can really continue living on in life despite throwing so many years away in a cause that ended up resulting in nothing. And even though there are moments where he falters and has doubts, he's still able to stand firm and move forward.